Okay, well, we are live. Only 1 minute late this week.
Wow.
I would say that's a pretty good achievement after last week. Last week we were in a little bit too late.
Last week was epic fail territory.
But that's okay. A minute, I think we're on time. We're doing uni student style. They're never early. They're never on time.
Yeah, normally it's about quarter past.
Yeah, exactly. Well, each week we're adding more and more things. So as you'll see, we've got a fancy sign behind us to let us know, just in case you didn't realise that we're on air, we're actually on air. We've got some more lovely teddy bears in our crowd tonight.
Yep.
So if you guys want to keep on naming them, still we only have Hot Fuzz. I don't think I've remembered any other name that anyone has added
Nothing stuck.
to it yet.
Nothing stuck.
So if you want to add some more names, that would be great. And something else that's new is we now have a YouTube channel.
We do. We do.
How awesome. We are raising it up, getting more and more out there. So with our YouTube channel, started this week, and it's as a precaution, but also that's where we're going to be posting our talks each week, our shows. And we want to say that we can go live there eventually. So if we ever have something that happens like last week, technology fails us, Facebook doesn't let us go live in that way, we have YouTube as well. So I want to share that with you guys to let you know, go look up our YouTube channel. So obviously Tuesday Night Live is our channel. And what you need to do, there's a lot of videos who are called Tuesday Night Live. But if you search in YouTube Tuesday Night Live, filter it by looking for channels, you'll find us straight away. And there we'll post tonight's show, right? At
the end of the show. So we should be recording as we speak.
There you
go. And then Leslie puts her thumb up, so we are recording. And so I hope if the recording goes well, we'll post on Tuesday Night Live. We're hoping to get the tech up and running over the next week or two to live stream to both YouTube and Facebook at the same time, to give you another place to invite friends to come and look for us. But we will hopefully have some more information in the coming weeks on that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's good. We're getting things going. We're here every week. It's going all right. We're so glad to have you guys all tuning in, sending us your questions, engaging with us. Keep it coming. We love to hear your comments. We love to hear how you guys are finding our Tuesday Night Lives, how you're going with the talks, how Mark as a story has been encouraging you and what you've been learning about Jesus. And tonight, our theme, we have a very interesting thing tonight. It's all about fear and confusion.
Yes.
So I'm really looking forward to this talk tonight because, we've heard a lot of perspectives throughout the weeks. And now, this one's going to be filled with fear and confusion. And you just kind of think, really, that's how we're going to end it?
Yeah.
On fear and confusion.
That's the same as it's been all the way through. I think we'll get to that later on as well, yes.
Yeah, so, and you might learn some new words tonight, which come back to me later if you learn a new word that I definitely learned. So fear and confusion. I find that very interesting. And as well, I feel like fear and confusion, Sanu, is something I always feel when you tell me a story.
Yeah.
Because some of your stories are just very interesting, but so different and so out there compared to some of my experiences. And I did make a joke earlier that he's got 25 more years experience. So, obviously there's some different stories going, but there's definitely there's always one that creates a lot of fear and confusion, especially if I was in that situation. And it's you and your brothers throwing coins in the dark.
Yes, yeah. There were 5 boys in one bedroom when I was a kid. We didn't have much money, and Dad had built dodgy renos on the back of the house, and so that covered our window, and so there was no light in the room. So when the lights switched off at night, it's pitch black, and there were 2 double bunks in a single bed. And once the lights were out, we would have coin fights. We'd throw 20, 50-cent pieces at each other in the pitch dark across the room. It was epic.
Yeah, see, me and my brother, when we lived in a room together, we used to play games and we used to have fun. We laughed. We didn't hurt each other.
Right.
We definitely weren't that type of family.
The sentence for a family that thrives on pain, so...
But see, that's not the story I want to hear about, because I've heard that story many, many times.
Yeah.
I've heard lots of your stories many times. A lot of us have. But I've never heard this one story that's coming up. Right. And I'm intrigued. I'm ready for fear and confusion because, now bear with me guys, because this is what I know so far. I've never heard this story before, but I know it involves a young Seno at Bible College. But the three kind of stages of this story, if I'm right, is there's a butcher, there's a bikie, and then there's a courthouse.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I don't know where this is going, but the fact that it's going to end in the courthouse makes me very, you know, confused and very interested. So, Seno, tonight, for our theme of fear and confusion, can you please tell us a great tall tale that you have to share with us? So, starting with the butcher, I guess.
This is a story that some of you, I think, will already know. I have told this story before, but you obviously haven't heard it. I was maybe 31 or so. So it's back in 1999. And I was at Bible College and living in Newtown. And there was a butcher down in Kirui, which is about half an hour from our college. And he was a Christian guy, and he wanted to support the students at the college. And so what he did was he would ask students to come down and labour for him on a Saturday morning, and he would pay us in meat. And so you would go to there about 6 in the morning on a Saturday morning, and you would work the whole morning for him in the shop. And then you take a big esky, and he would just pack it full of meat, whatever meat you wanted, all the best stuff. It was fantastic. And so I put a few of those in, put a bit of that in, and so I somehow finagled my way onto this roster. There were only a select group of students who got onto this roster.
Okay, so you had to be well known to get in.
Well, you had to know the right people. I think it was just one of those. I don't know how it happened, but I managed to get my way onto this roster for me. And so this story happens on the very first day, my very first time, my first rostered Saturday morning working at the butcher.
I don't know if that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, I was excited. You know, it was exciting. It was.
Okay, so exciting. First day, working at a butchery.
Full of beans. Yep. And so I'm driving, and I'm living in Newtown. I'm driving south on the Princess Highway down towards the Shire, if you know Sydney at all. And it's still dark. It's relatively dark, but it's misty. There's a really thick fog everywhere, so you can see a couple of 100 metres or so, but not very far. And I'm driving down, crossing the Cooks River Bridge on the Princess Highway. And so the highway is 3 lanes in each direction, but there's no dividers. It's just like 6 lanes across the road over this bridge. And ahead of me, I see this beautiful, beautiful maroon Jaguar driving in front of me. And as I watch, this Jaguar goes from the left-hand lane here and just weaves slowly all the way across, all the way over the other side of the highway into the other oncoming lanes, all the way to the far left lane, the other side of the highway, and then all the way back over. And so I'm looking at this car, I'm thinking, this guy's drunk and this is trouble. And he's driving quite slowly, and so I catch up to him reasonably quickly, and I get past him, and I think, oh, dodged a bullet. And, you know, and so I keep driving, and I drive a couple of k's down the road, getting towards Rockdale, and I stop at a set of lights. And so I stop at this set of lights, and I'm just waiting for the lights to turn green. All of a sudden, I hear this of brakes and bang into the back of the car. And sure enough, I look in my mirror, there's a maroon Jag planted in the back of my little Toyota Corolla.
Yeah.
And so I think, so I thought I'd got away with it. And so I get out of the car and start walking back. And as I do, these two, this little red car zooms in and pulls up behind the Jag, and 2 young blokes get out, very agitated. And as I'm walking towards the car, they say, he's already running to us. He sideswiped us before he hit you. He's drunk. We need to get him out of the car before he kills someone. So we think, okay. And so we walk up to the window, and the window kind of goes down about this far on the Jag. And we're looking at this guy. He just looks out of it. He looks about 60 years old. He's got a big walrus moustache, all grey, massive head, really beetroot red. And his eyes are just completely out of focus. He looks totally gone. And these guys are at him, you know, you idiot, you're drunk, get out of the car, you're going to kill someone. And I just looked at him for a few seconds. I said, mate, are you all right? And he kind of looks at us, and then he shakes his head, and then he takes off. He just takes off. He plants it, and he goes. He's gone. And so we look at each other, and we jump in our cars, and we're off after him. And this is Rockdale at 6 in the morning. It's fog, thick fog everywhere. You can hardly see 100 metres. Hardly anyone's on the road, but the fog is really thick, so we can't go really fast because you can't see. And so we're belting down the road. We can't see him. He's gone. He's just gone for all money. Can't see him, hiding ahead of him. A few k's further down the road, we get to this massive intersection, and it's the intersection for Rockdale Plaza. You turn left into Rockdale Plaza. And so we're driving down here, and sure enough, there he is. He's gone through the red light, and he's totaled this Commodore. So he's hit this Commodore. The Commodore spun around a few times. It's parked over here. His car stopped in the middle of the intersection, right? And we think, we've got to get this guy out of his car, right? And so I pull up behind him. The other car, the red car, pulls up in front of him. We get out of the car, and we start walking towards this Jag to get him out. Well, the door to the Jag opens. This big guy, he's a big guy, right? Big head, big horse massage. He gets out. He's got a Rebel bikie jacket on and a gun sticking out of his pants. And we just took a look at him and went, whoa! And so we just kind of walked over this way, and he stumbled off. He just stumbled off and was lost in the distance. And, you know, by this time, there's a few people around because the car's being hit, people are starting to gather. And so someone called the cops, and they mentioned the G word. The cops are there within a few, you know, within a couple of minutes. There's 5 or 6 cop cars. But before the cop cars get there, right, this white minivan turns up, and a bikie gets out, and a young bikie lady gets out as well. And they say, oh, where did the guy who's driving this car go? And someone said, oh, he went disappeared over that way. So off they go looking for him. So they're gone off looking for him. Then the cops descend and they arrive, and they're everywhere. They're looking for him as well, and driving around the streets, and there's cops all standing around. They start taking our statements. And so, you know, we're just sitting there waiting to have a statement taken, and someone notices that the woman has showed up back at the van. And someone just points her out and says, oh, she was with him. And so the coppers go over there and they start talking to this young bikie lady, and they're just talking to her for a minute or so, and then all of a sudden they're slamming her up against the side of the van and cuffing her. And someone actually points over because the guy, the bikie who showed up with her, he's like about 100 metres away at the other side of this intersection, just watching, like a bystander, just watching. And someone just points out and says, oh, he was with her as well. Oh, no. The coppers turn to him and he's gone. He's running off. And so it's just drama everywhere. And so, you know, the car's smacked into, I give my statement, and then I drive down the road to the butcher.
So you still went to work?
I still went to work. I showed up. Well, it was a fried breakfast. You know, he's fried up some meat for breakfast. So that was, I had to go and eat breakfast. Wow. But, yeah, that was my first day at the butcher's at Kirrawee, a bikie and a gun. They didn't catch him.
Okay, they did.
They found him in a petrol station down the road, collapsed with his gun under him.
Oh no!
And he died on the way to the hospital, but they revived him. And so it was there was lots of drama.
There's so much going on. I wasn't expecting the white van to pull up and 2 more bikies to come out. But you said there was a courtroom. Like you said, there's more to come.
So I gave my statement, and then I had to go to the police station a couple of days later and just give another statement to the detectives. And they said to me on the day, they said, look, you're not going to be asked to come to court because this guy, we want this guy for serious drug importation issues and all that. So we have big crimes. So they're going to cop the little stuff. They're already going to cop the car. They won't worry about it. And so I said, that's great. I'm happy with that. And then a few weeks later, I get in the mail a summons to appear at court to come and give evidence against a bikie in front of all these bikie mates.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm thinking, so I'm going to go and sit in a courtroom and point him out.
How scared were you?
I was a little fearful. I was a little concerned. So so I was thinking, what about it? So I turned up. I showed up to court, and I'm sitting there outside, and then one of the lawyers comes out and says, oh, we don't need you. Go home.
This is really not true, mate.
And so that was a day in the life of. That was a fun day. I don't know how those things kind of happen, but
that is full on.
True story.
First day. That's not what you expect. I don't think I've ever had a first day like that.
No, yeah.
Very crazy. Whoa.
I've had a couple of epic first days actually.
There you go. Well, maybe we can hear about them another time.
Yeah.
I don't know if any's going to beat that one, to be honest, but maybe you can test me on that. But that is definitely, by definition, a very unlikely story, but true.
But true.
That's something that you see in the movies, and you think, oh, that doesn't happen in real life, and yet here you are in real life.
Yeah. It is weird, those things, that these bizarre and unlikely things, and you see them all the time on the internet. Completely weird stories. You think that couldn't have happened, but it did happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's actually what we're going to be reading about tonight. That's what you're going to be giving a talk on.
Or something everyone thought couldn't happen.
Yeah.
And wasn't going to happen. That did happen.
It did.
Yeah.
So that's a good point for us, I guess, to pass on to Alice. We're going to be reading from the Bible. We're in our last night of Mark. We're going to be reading Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. Alice is going to do that. Just before she does, though, grab your Bibles, get ready. If you don't have a Bible, we've actually posted in the group those verses for you to read. So read along there, read in your Bible, but Alice is now going to read for us.
Hey guys, so like they said, we're reading from Mark chapter 16, verse 1 to 8. If you want to read with me. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
A few years ago, I watched an episode of the ABC program Q&A, where they held their episode live at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. And this festival is for controversial, I guess, or revolutionary ideas from around the world. And they had panelists who were appearing at the festival, speakers at the festival, come on to their Q&A panel. And at the end of the episode, they asked each panel member the same question. And it was this: what do you think is the most dangerous idea in the world today? And everyone had their own answer. And eventually they came to a fellow named Peter Hitchens, who's a journalist from England. And he said this. He said the most revolutionary, the most dangerous idea in history is the idea, the belief, that Jesus rose from the dead. He said if that is true, it is the most dangerous idea in history because it changes absolutely everything. I wonder if you agree. I wonder if that's what you think about the resurrection of Jesus. Certainly I agree with Peter Hitchens. And tonight we're going to look at the ending of Mark and explore what it has to say about Jesus' resurrection. But before we get on to that, I need to talk to you a little bit about background, because you'll notice from our Bible reading that we didn't read all of Mark chapter 16. We just read the first 8 verses. Why was that? Well, I need to give you a little bit of background as to why and explain why it is that we're not looking at those last 11 or 12 verses from verse 9 onwards. And we start back with how the Gospels were written and transmitted. Back in the time of Jesus, paper and writing were a relatively new technology. They'd moved from clay tablets and things like that into this new technology based on papyrus, the papyrus reed and paper. But it was incredibly expensive. This was the high-tech communication vehicle of its day. But writing and therefore scribing onto paper was incredibly expensive and a profession. And so what would happen is Mark has put together his gospel, his biography of Jesus, and he's written it down. Now, he's written it for the sake of the church. And so perhaps right at the very beginning, as he writes this onto the scroll, or he gets it written on the scroll by a scribe, he's already thinking about copying it out to all the different churches. So what happens there?
Well, the process, the technology is unlike today. We can't copy and paste from one document to another and have absolutely accurate transmission of data, although even copy and paste can be a bit funny, can't it? But back in that day, you had to sit down with the text on one side and a blank paper on the other, and you had to look and then write and scribe across. And that's how you copied. Now, you can imagine the process of copying. There are natural errors you can make. You can misspell words, you can miss out words and skip from one to the other because your eyes are tired. You may even miss whole lines of text. And as you watch these copies being made, and copies of those copies and copies of those copies going to cities like Alexandria and Rome and Damascus and Jerusalem and all these big cities where there were big churches, you saw these copies, you saw mistakes move through these copies, and hundreds, well, thousands of years later now, we have somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000, I think it is, fragments or copies of the New Testament. And we can look at those and we can see where those mistakes were made in the different texts. And so what you have in front of you in the New Testament is an incredibly reliable text, because we actually see where all these errors were made in copying the text. And we can actually see where the original text was and show you what was most likely the original text. However, there's also another way for the text to change. One way is by accident, by mistake, as a copyist copies it. But the other way for a mistake to creep into the text is deliberately. Sometimes, and at certain points, people who were copying the text out thought there needs to be more here. And when, at those points you actually see your New Testament, it's actually marked those passages out. It's marked them out saying the earliest manuscripts do not have this text. And so sometimes you see those verses in, sometimes they're put in a footnote, but they're marked out saying they're not in a reliable text. Why do those verses occur here? Why do we see the last 11 verses of Mark, even though in the process of looking at all the thousands of different manuscripts in the New Testament, we can see for certain that these weren't part of the original text? So why are they still in there? Well, the answer is tradition. The answer is that over centuries and centuries, these were just left in the text. And so people felt bad about leaving them out, even though they knew they weren't part of the original copy of Mark. And so that's why you have those verses there, but marked out as saying they aren't part of the earliest and original texts of Mark. And so that's why we won't be looking at those verses, even though they're there. And one of the things you'll notice if you look at them, and if you know your New Testament a little bit, is you can actually see where these verses have been cobbled from all different places in other Gospels, in the book of Acts, and some of the epistles. You can actually see where these verses come from. But that's an exercise for later you can do on your own. Feel free to come back at me in question time in the comments about that. But we're going to move into Mark chapter 16 now. And Mark chapter 16 is what they call a denouement of the gospel. If last week is the climax of the story, where we looked at the cross of Jesus and why that's such a foundational and significant moment in history, the resurrection is the denouement of the story, the bit where all the little bits are kind of tied off and finished up at the end of the story. And so we come to this event and we see it as a drama, firstly. We see this drama unfold because we meet at the beginning of chapter 16 a group of women who are travelling to the tomb of Jesus to, it seems, prepare his body further for burial, for being kept in the crypt for a long time. And there were herbs and spices they had to apply. I don't know exactly what they needed to do, but they were travelling to the tomb to do those things. And these women are significant because these are the people who've stuck with Jesus the longest. We didn't really pay much attention to it last week, but Jesus' disciples, the 12, the ones we call the apostles, the great ones, they were all gone. They'd run away. They'd abandoned Jesus. These women stuck with him to the bitter end. These were his most faithful followers. They were there. If you look back in chapter 15 at verse 40, you see them there. Have a look at 15 verse 40. It says, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So while all his disciples had abandoned him, these women are with him to the bitterest end. They followed him right to the end. And here they are on the first Sunday after the Sabbath, so a couple of days later, coming to the tomb to care for his body in the final stages, I guess, of its burial. And they're walking towards the tomb, and you can see the drama of it. Have a look. We're going to pick it up in chapter 16, verse 1. Have a look. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" This is a natural scene. This is a normal thing. They would have been walking there. I imagine they would still be sharing their grief and sharing the stories of their grief with one another, but this activity they're engaged in, people had been doing for decades, for centuries, following their traditions, preparing the body further for its burial. And so they're walking, they're just having normal conversations, and they're wondering, well, what's going to happen? Because they know that the tomb that Jesus was placed in had a large stone rolled across the entrance by the Romans. And so they're thinking, well, how is this going to work? How are we going to open the tomb? Just a natural kind of things occurring in these few verses. But then we come to this unnatural discovery. Have a look at verse 4. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Now, I don't know about you, but I can imagine this. I think women have better peripheral vision than men, so I'm told, but I can imagine them being surprised because the stone's already gone from the tomb, and so they're kind of curious and wondering. And they walk in there, and I guess the first thing maybe they notice is there's no body. They don't really mention that, but they catch in their peripheral vision this young man. You can imagine, you know how someone who walks up behind you and as they're coming to your vision, you have a jump, you start. You can imagine their fear, that sense of electricity as they notice this young man as they come into the tomb. It's this extra detail. This is unnatural. Something is wrong, and they're bewildered. They're alarmed. They're a little bit scared. But if they were a little bit scared before, what happens next, what this young man says, sends them into a complete tizzy. Have a look at verse 6. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." I wonder how you would react to that. This young man comes out and says, he is not here, he is risen. I wonder what your response would be. I can tell you what my response would be. I would be more than a little bit freaked out, not to mention confused. If someone I knew to be dead, someone I'd seen die with my own eyes, someone I knew to be buried, and I come to their tomb and their tomb is empty and this person says to me he's risen from the dead, I'm not sure what my first thought would be, but it would not be, oh hooray, look, isn't that wonderful? I would be startled. I'd be afraid. I would wonder what was going on. And that's the reaction of the women. Their reaction is confusion and fear. Look at what it says in 16 verse 8, they're trembling and bewildered. They are filled with confusion and they are filled with fear. They do not know what's going on. These people who are his most faithful followers did not expect this. And in fact, confusion and fear are really some of the themes of this story. In a sense, this little story at the end sums up the reactions to Jesus all the way through the book from the very beginning. Right at the very beginning, when Jesus said to the young man who was lowered through the roof, his sins are forgiven, and then he healed his legs and told him to get up and walk, people were astounded. They were bewildered. They were amazed. They didn't understand what was going on. When Jesus calmed the storm with a word and said to the waves and the wind, be still, and they were completely still and the sea was calm, his disciples were terrified. When he healed the man who was filled with demons in chapter 5, the people who saw this man who they'd been afraid of healed, they were afraid of Jesus and they asked him to leave. When the woman who touched Jesus' cloak in chapter 5 and was healed of her bleeding that she'd had for 12 years. When Jesus called her to himself, she came trembling with fear. People are filled with fear through this gospel. They're afraid of who Jesus is. They're afraid of what these things might mean. And they're filled with confusion. His disciples just are continually confused about Jesus and who he is and what he's come to do. And it just intensifies in the second half of the book, as we saw last week. When they get to the second half and they know who Jesus is, he's God's great king who's come to save, and Jesus tells them what is about to happen to them. He tells them he's about to die. They don't understand what he's saying. They just can't compute it. They can't understand it. And so when it comes to Jesus' death, they all run away. They don't understand. And these women who'd followed him to the very end, when they're confronted with the empty tomb and when this figure tells them that Jesus is risen from the dead, they are confused and they're afraid. And I think there's a part of me that feels a bit the same at the end of Mark. If I'm just reading the story, if I absorb myself in the story at ground level and look at people and put myself beside people through the book, and I get to the end and this happens, there's a part of me that's a little bit confused and a little bit afraid. What's going on? Could this be true? Could it be true that Jesus has risen from the dead? Could it be true all those things he said about himself? That he's the one who has power to forgive? That he's the one who's going to bear the cost of forgiveness? He's going to give his life as a ransom on our behalf? That he's the one who claims our whole lives? Could it be true? What if this is true? What if Jesus has risen from the dead? Well, friends, if this is true, then so many other things in this story are true as well. Because if this is true, then Jesus' diagnosis of me and of you is also true. He calls us people who need to be forgiven. He calls us people who stand in front of God who are evil. That evil comes from inside of us. It pollutes us. It cuts us off from God. And that we need God's forgiveness. If the resurrection is true, then Jesus' diagnosis of you and I is also true. But it's also true that he has died in our place. If Jesus' resurrection is true, then the meaning that Jesus has of his death is also true. Remember, we looked at that last week, at the different perspectives on Jesus and the cross. Well, if this resurrection has happened, then what Jesus said about his death is true. That he really did die as a ransom for us. He died in our place. He died to take our punishment, our judgment. He died to heal the separation between us and God. He died to bring us forgiveness. That's also true. And if Jesus has risen from the dead, if this is true, then Jesus' offer to us is also true. That he offers us forgiveness, if only we will come to him and entrust our lives to him. Will we trust Jesus? If the resurrection is true, then this also is true. That Jesus stands in front of each one of us and he looks at us and he knows us. He knows us completely and intimately. And yet he loves us. And what he demands of us is that we trust him. That we entrust ourselves to him. That we give our lives to him. And so the big question that this poses, the big question this moment of confusion and fear poses to each one of us is, what do you believe about the resurrection? Do you believe that Jesus is risen from the dead? See, friends, for those of us who are Christians, this moment is a great encouragement to us. This moment is the great moment of our confession, isn't it? Because as much as Christians wear the crosses around their necks and on their churches, what's our profession? What's the thing that's on our lips all the time? The confession of the Christian is Jesus Christ is Lord. And what we mean by that is that Jesus who died for us is risen from the dead and even now is alive and rules and saves us. The resurrection for us as we move through the confusion and fear is an incredible encouragement. It says to us that we are forgiven. That our end is not simply to die in the dust and to face God's anger. That we can be forgiven and have life. And it calls us into a life of following Jesus, of following in his footsteps. For us, this moment, we move through our confusion and fear and into faith, into trust at the end. Because we know Jesus, in fact, is risen from the dead, and therefore that all of this is true. But this moment is also an appeal. If you are there this evening, if you're listening into the live stream and you're not a Christian, this moment is a moment that appeals to you, it calls to you. Jesus says, I am risen. Will you believe it? Will you trust it? Will you entrust yourself to me? And it calls you to find out the truth of it, doesn't it? Could this in fact be true? Here is the one moment, friends, where you can ask the question, where you can explore and discover, what do I believe about the resurrection of Jesus? Because everything else you believe about the Christian faith hangs on this. If Jesus is not risen from the dead, then nothing else makes sense. You can roll along in the story of Jesus on the level of the crowds and just go, blah, 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 it doesn't matter. Whatevs. Because he's not in fact risen from the dead. But if Jesus has risen, then friends, that changes everything. This idea is dangerous for you because this idea will turn your life upside down. It will call you to trust Jesus with your whole life. So can I encourage you, if you're not a Christian here tonight, to put your effort into finding out what you believe about Jesus. Take a clear and close look at Jesus. Think about him. Ask the big questions of the resurrection. Feel free to place a comment, a question in the comments, and we'll address that at question time if we can. Perhaps we can chase something further down the road. But find a Christian friend who in these days of isolation will Zoom chat or Facebook something with you, messenger kind of chat with you, and read through one of the Gospels or look at the New Testament or ask the big questions about, is Jesus really risen from the dead? And I want to just turn away. Don't turn off. I'm just going to turn around for a second. I want to recommend to you again this book, Uncover. This is the biography of Jesus from Mark. And you can read this with a friend, but you can find any Bible with the biography of Mark in it and read it online with a friend. We've got some copies here that if you get onto us, we might be able to send you a copy. But you can read this with a friend and work out what it is you think about Jesus. Who do you think he is? Are you convinced that he rose from the dead? Because I want to suggest to you that this is the most significant thing, the most significant decision you could make in your entire life. Whether you believe Jesus really is risen. Will you move beyond the confusion and fear that this idea represents, the danger this idea represents, and understand the comfort that it brings, because we know we have a King who saves us. How about we pray? Lord God, we thank you for your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. We thank you that we can be confident that he is in fact risen from the dead. But we thank you for this account of his resurrection that helps us to understand not just the doubts and fears and uncertainties of those who followed him most closely, but also our doubts and fears and uncertainties. And we pray as we read this together, you'd help us to work through those things, to understand that Jesus has in fact risen, to put our trust in him, and to receive the great comfort that comes with that. Amen. I'll see you in question time, but next we have something different.
Hey everyone, I'm Nelson. I'm a third-year dental student and I'm from OCS. And I'm just here to update you on what OCS has been doing and how COVID-19 has affected us and what we're doing to cope with it. So just like BCS, we haven't been able to meet up as a group. And we've actually, most of us have returned back home, whether it's interstate or back to Sydney as well. So we actually have split up into smaller groups as well. And I believe this week we are covering Luke 5 in our smaller groups. And most of us actually have joined BCS talks every Tuesday nights, and we just joined from that time as well. So we do have a WhatsApp group as well. So when we have questions in the smaller groups and we don't know how to answer that, we actually do send it through the WhatsApp group as well. And Greg just helps us out. And so if you're not in a small group and you're from OCS, do let me know, and we'll be able to sort something out for you as well. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it from OCS and what we've been actually doing. And so I'll lead us in prayer right now. So let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we are here praying to you, knowing that you are fully in control of all things, even in this chaotic world. We are sorry we have acted in a way that is not pleasing to you, and we pray that we continue to strive to become more like you. We'd like to give thanks for BCS Talks, and that is a platform that we can all still meet up and study the Word of God. We would like to pray for the world as COVID-19 is still prevalent. We pray that you let us see that it's not a barrier, but an opportunity to share the gospel with non-believers. We also pray for our small groups, that we continue to gather online and fellowship with one another. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Perfect. I'm just going to send it back to Caitlin and Senna, back onto the lounge.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nelson. It's wonderful to hear how you're going, how the Orange Christian students are going as well. Especially, we often see you a little bit at things like our getaway that we were supposed to be having, or just at other times. And so we're really missing seeing Orange people. And so it's good to know that you guys are going all right. And definitely, if you're part of the Orange group, or if you're from Orange Uni, please definitely check out everything that Nelson mentioned. If you missed anything, maybe send him a message or a personal message, or anyone that you know from Orange to get more involved with the group. But for now, we are going to jump into question time because there's lots of questions. Because that was a very full-on talk.
Yes, I think the questions are pretty full-on too. There are a lot of questions. We might not get to all of them tonight. We'll see how we go. But we might follow it up with a bit of a post during the week, just with a couple of the later ones. So thanks very much for keeping coming with the questions. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it was really awesome. I loved how in your talk you talked about the natural movement in the story from a very natural scene. So like you and your first day, just going along to your first day, and yet how things changed and it became very unnatural. It became very filled with these emotions and something very different that they did not expect out of what they're about to do. So that's really cool. So let's jump into some questions for you, Senna. I hope you're ready for them. They're going to come at you. Our first question tonight is from Lachlan Batley. So he said, I've read different sources all saying that different gospels were the first ever written. What do you think was the first gospel? Does it matter?
Okay. I don't think it does matter, really. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. I think it seems most likely that Mark was the first gospel written. Why do I think that? Partly it's because that it seems that Matthew and Luke both use the backbone of Mark as part of their gospel narrative, and they fill that out with extra stories about Jesus that they've cobbled together for themselves. So it seems like both Matthew and Luke almost like they have a copy of Mark sitting on the desk, or at least they have that framework from Mark. So yes, it's not a settled question, but most people think Mark was written first.
Okay, we've got some questions, I think, about some of the other ones later. But we'll move on to Stanley's question. He asked, why did the disciples refuse to believe Jesus when he told them he was going to die on numerous occasions? So we've seen that all through Mark.
That's a really good question, Stanley, because it happens at least 3 times. Jesus tells them explicitly, I think probably 4 when you count chapter 10, I'm going to die. And I'm going to rise, and they just don't seem to understand it. They don't seem to accept it. And I think partly the reason is because it is so far out of any imaginings they had about what God's saving King would do. you remember they were expecting someone to come. Everyone was waiting for God to send his great Christ, his Messiah, his saving King. And people had in their mind fixed expectations. And you can imagine that, I think. Imagine you go on a blind date and your friend tells you what your date is like. And then you show up and the person is just nothing like you were told. And it's kind of like that, but on steroids, because they were expecting God to send his incredible, great, saving King, and yet they were not expecting that King to come and die. They didn't think the answer to the world's problems was the death of the King. And yet that's exactly God's answer. And so they've got, I guess, expectations to unlearn. And they're stubborn. They're just like us in a way. They don't accept. They're skeptics. And you see that when you read the other stories of the resurrection, in fact, that they didn't believe that it happened either. And so they don't understand what Jesus says. And so it's a common theme. And I think it's partly for the same reason we would be, because they had expectations that didn't match the Jesus who actually came at them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. I hope that helps, Stanley. We've got some more questions about the text. So Beth Thompson, she's asked, why were the women afraid when they left the tomb? She says that she can understand feeling confused and shocked, but she really doesn't understand why afraid.
Yeah. I don't know. Of course, we don't actually know, but I speculate. I think it might have something to do with this young man. Not only the shock and fear of actually seeing him appear, but also that he knows things about them and their friends that they've never met this guy, and yet he knows things about them. And I think anybody would be discombobulated by that. That if someone came and they knew things about you, that how could they know that? And so I think that perhaps might be partly to do with it. I think also you've got to remember that even though these are Jesus' most faithful followers, they did not expect this to happen. All of them. They're not coming expecting to see Jesus risen from the dead. They're coming to the tomb ready to add spices to his body for his final burial. They did not expect him to rise. And so even though they're the ones that are there, this still has confounded all their expectations. They did not expect this. And so I can imagine them being incredibly afraid about that. About this thing, that what because it begs the question, doesn't it, what might be true? And I think there's a sense in which that's the question that the text begs of us. If this is true, this changes everything, and I think that instills a bit of fear in all of us. Your whole life, everything, your hopes, your expectations, your dreams, the way you live, who you are as a person, is altered and affected by this event. And being confronted with that all in one moment, I can imagine would be pretty fearful.
See, I've got a follow-up question to that, though. So I wonder if this will help you, Beth, a little bit. But this is not the first time that the dead have been raised in the Gospels. And it's happened throughout the Bibles on a few occasions. But I'm particularly thinking about when Jesus raises Lazarus. And fear is not one of the responses of the crowd, which I don't know, is that interesting that then they're filled with fear with Jesus when he's risen, but yet not with Lazarus, because they're confused and shocked a little bit, but I think they celebrate. Yeah,
it might be to do with the significance of those two things. So the raising of Lazarus, the raising of the young girl that we saw a few weeks ago in Mark chapter 5, they're all things they're miracles, if you like, that Jesus performs. They're things that he does. And so they have their own, people are amazed, some people are fearful about those things, but there's an amazement that goes with those things. This is incredible. But Jesus' resurrection is something else entirely. And I think that's probably significant to notice, that the resurrection of Jesus is something that is different to those things. Those people rose to die again, just like you're dying once in a hospital when you're a child, you were revived, and you will eventually die again, and that's what would have happened to Lazarus and to the young girl. Jesus' resurrection is different. It's a different thing. Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of the resurrection of that great day, and so Jesus has risen never to die, and so it's a different kind of thing. And I wonder if there's something to do with that as well.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, it impacts. So Jesus it's not just a story, it actually impacts us with whether or not we actually take hold of it, which is very different to any other.
Yeah, you can't
story.
stand at this moment, you can't stand in front of the tomb with these women and be completely unaffected. You can dismiss it, if you like, but you can't be unaffected by it.
Yeah.
And that's why Peter Hitchens said it was the most dangerous idea in history.
Okay. Well, some more questions about text from tonight. Laura, Joseph, and Aidan have actually asked the same question. Is there a particular reason that Peter is mentioned aside from the disciples? So they're saying the disciples and Peter.
Yeah, another good question. And it's one of the things I reckon when you read through the story that you notice as you read, because that Peter is picked out as, in many times he acts as the spokesman for the disciples. He'll be the one who'll come and speak to Jesus on behalf of the disciples. I think, is it Peter who comes up to him in the boat? I can't remember. It might have just been the disciples. But Peter's often the one who speaks to him, or James and John. And so amongst the 12, there seem to be Peter, but also James and John are three that they seem to be special in some way to Jesus. They seem to be prominent amongst the 12. Maybe they're the most go-getters, but they certainly seem to be, when Jesus goes and does something special, he often takes those three. So when he goes to heal a girl, who does he take with him? Peter, James and John. When he goes up to the Mountain of Transfiguration, who does he take with him? Peter, James and John in chapter 9. So Peter, James and John are prominent. And amongst Peter, James and John, who is it that speaks to Jesus on the Transfiguration Mountain? It's Peter, who says that dumb thing about building tents. And so Peter's often the one who says the dumb thing everyone's meant to say. It's why we often look at Peter's betrayal of Jesus and go, oh, isn't that a terrible betrayal? But you've got to remember, Peter was there to betray Jesus. Where were the rest of them? The rest of them were gone. They'd split and run off. Peter stuck there long enough to be able to betray Jesus in that room. And so, yes, they do seem to be his most prominent of his disciples.
Okay, so that, interesting. Hey, a big question coming up from Rachel Stewart, and she's asked another one, so we'll see if we get to it. So in Mark 15:46, it says that Joseph puts Jesus' body in the tomb and rolled a stone over the entrance. But then in Mark 16, verse 4, it places emphasis on how large the stone was. If Joseph was able to close Jesus's tomb, then how big was the stone? Why then would the women be so surprised that it had been rolled away if it only took one man to close it in the first place?
Well, we don't really know. It could be that it's a stone that's too big for the women to deal with, but this, some hefty bloke could deal with it. But it could well be that Joseph had someone help him as well. It just says Joseph rolled the stone. It doesn't say he did it alone. It is notable in most of the accounts that the stone takes trouble to roll over the tomb. And so it might even be at least a two-man job. So, so Joseph took care of it, but how he did it, we don't know.
Yeah. Okay, well, she's actually got a follow-up question about this whole tomb stuff. So she must really like the tombs. But she wants to know if basically everyone who was crucified were placed in tombs. I guess, was it special that Jesus was placed in a tomb in the first place, or were other people treated this way?
No, not particularly special, Rachel. I think a lot of people were placed in tombs or buried in the ground. So a tomb is a more middle-class burial. So if you go to a cemetery, most people are there with a grave and a headstone. But you notice there are the more wealthy people. They have the big kind of cenotaphs or that sort of the crypts, that sort of thing. They have a little kind of house, and often the whole family will be placed in those burial chambers. And so even today we see there's a difference. It's about basically how much money you've got to spend. And so Joseph is someone with some wealth, and he donates his tomb, and his tomb's probably a more wealthy person's tomb. Okay. So most people would probably go into the ground.
Very interesting. Any tombs today? I see people getting buried in tombs. Okay, we've got a question from Ryan on this passage, but more about that being affected by it.
Yeah.
So Ryan asks, why do you think there are those that say they believe in what has happened in these verses, yet seem to be unaffected by it? What is it that they don't get? Can you still call them a Christian?
That's a really good question. I think all of my life, I thought these things were true. and they had zero impact on my life at all. And I remember once in the when I worked at CSIRO, we had a tea room, and all the scientists, we'd get together in the tea room for morning tea together. And I remember one day, one of the research scientists at morning tea, he was talking about a book he'd read. I think it was a book about child psychology or something. But the comment he made, I think, was really insightful. He said, as I was reading this book, I realised that it was true. And because it was true, it changed everything. And I think if you understand that the resurrection is true, rather than just acknowledging some fact in the world, if you actually think this is true, it must change everything. And so you cannot be unaffected by it if you really believe it's true. And so I think that's probably the thing. So would I call myself a Christian when I thought that the gospel had happened, but it had no impact on my life? I don't think I understood what the gospel meant. So I didn't really think it was true. Because if you think the resurrection is true, you believe that not only is Jesus alive right now, but that Jesus rules right now. That what Jesus says is is what your life is about. That he rules your life, and what he says you do. And so if you say, I believe this is true, but it doesn't affect the way you live, then you actually haven't understood this thing as true, because you actually don't understand what the thing itself means. So you might acknowledge a historical fact, but you haven't actually understood the meaning of the thing. I'm not sure if I explained that well. Perhaps you can come back with a comment later.
And what a good time for us to really be recognising this, to be hearing this story again, and actually thinking about the resurrection, that it's not just the cross, that's not where it ends, that's not the end of the story, but it's the fact that Jesus has risen when we're about to celebrate Easter this weekend.
Yes.
And yes, we'll be celebrating it very differently, but the truth is we're still coming back to that core of Jesus rose. Yeah. And that's how we're impacted.
Yeah. Well, so much so that the key Christian confession, isn't it? That the key thing that Christians say is Jesus Christ is Lord. What does that statement even mean when we say Jesus Christ is Lord? What we're saying is Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, God's great King, is Lord of all. He is risen from the dead, and he rules even now. And so our confession is the resurrection of Jesus. It's what tells us that the death of Jesus actually paid for our sins, which we looked at last week, that we are forgiven. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I think that's a great time to stop, really, because some of the other questions, there's still more questions, and that is something that you can get to later on in the week. So I know you said that you're going to do that.
I'll definitely do a follow-up post. There's too many questions to ignore. So
yes, definitely. And they are all really good questions, so we don't want to miss you, but we also don't want you to keep on here all night, because I'm sure we could if we wanted to. But maybe just in reflection of that last question, perhaps you can take some time this week to actually think about how the cross, how the resurrection has impacted your life, whether it has, and so far, how you can be encouraged by that, how you can be reminded of that, especially as we come across this weekend and we spend time celebrating that. But if it hasn't impacted you yet, or perhaps it impacted you tonight, please spend some more time to think about that, to pray to God, tell him how it has impacted you, but to also share it with your friend who's invited you along tonight, your friend who has been telling you about Jesus or wanting to read the Bible with you. Please share it with them, because there would be nothing more joyous than for us to hear how this truly unbelievable yet true story has changed your life. So please do that. Share with us those stories. And for the time being, we will see you next week.